All right. So, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Louisiana. And today is January 24th, 2025, about 9:46 a.m., where I'm at right now. And today, we are completing, we are finishing, we are crossing the finish line for this book, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th-Century South, written by Martha Hodes. This is an 8-chapter book that I picked up last year, and I just started reading at the beginning of this year. And this, by far, has been one of the most excellent, informed, entertaining, sad, depressing, enlightening books that I've ever read, and I can't wait to read more books in this Book to React series. This is part 8, so go check out the other books we've read in this series, such as Cyber Racism, Is the Turk a White Man, Afro Pessimism, and the other books that you can find on the playlist Book React on my channel. So this book you can pick up on Amazon for the humble price of only $28 hardcover and $15.87 in paperback. This is the Amazon link right here. And I encourage everybody who is tuning in now to go check out the previous live streams. There are 7 other live streams, and this will be the final one for chapter 8, the epilogue, and also reading briefly on how Martha Hodes did the research for this book. And let's go here. So, chapter 8, Murder, Black Men, White Women, and Lynching. Let's just jump right into it. Before I do that, quick water break. Quick sip, and let's go. As the history of sex between Black men and white women reaches the last decade of the 19th century, the stories become a series of false accusations of rape, followed by certain violent death for the man. Thus, the historical record here accords most closely with modern assumptions about the past treatment of transgressors. At the same time, the relation between rape accusations and lynching in the post-Reconstruction South was a sinister one. Lynching was relatively rare before the Civil War, but between 1882 and 1900, more than 1,000 people in the South were killed by whites who took the law into their own hands. Lynchings peaked in 1892, and in all years, the overwhelming majority of victims were Black men. Whites routinely claimed that the rape of white women was the prime cause, yet this oft-repeated statement was untrue in 2 senses. Not only was there no post-war wave of such sexual assaults, but rape was not in fact the cause white Southerners recorded most frequently when justifying specific lynchings. In spite of these 2 facts, white apologists relentlessly named the rape of white women as the reason for murdering Black men and fully intended the lynching of Black men to sustain an atmosphere of terrorism that was in turn intended to maintain the racial hierarchy that emancipation and Reconstruction had begun to destroy. Lynchings differed from Klan assaults in that the perpetrators were largely undisguised and the murder was open to the public. When a Black man was lynched for the alleged rape of a white woman, the execution was likely to be carried out by mass mob. Vivid descriptions were frequently printed in the national press in a composite portrait of the most gruesome, though not atypical, such lynchings. The appointed victim might be a neighbor or a stranger. The charge might be suspected or wholly fabricated. Capture might involve white people taking the man forcibly from the street, his workplace, or his home. If a man was already under arrest, it meant taking him forcibly from the local jail with little or no objection from the white jailer or sheriff. White people of all classes came from miles away to participate in the spectacle, sometimes with their children and picnic supplies in tow. Notices might be printed in local papers, railroad companies might add extra cars or run special trains, and children might be given the day off from school to attend. That's crazy. I didn't know that. Like adding extra cars to a train so that people can attend a lynching, a murder, a mob murder of a Black man is insane. Giving children the day off from school. No need to study and read today. We're going to go watch that Negro bleed. Insane. That's insane. The crowd could be composed of hundreds or thousands, including local officers of the law. The method of murder might include mutilation, castration, skinning, roasting, burning, hanging, and shooting. Afterward, the audience might gather souvenirs, including rope, ashes, buttons, toes, fingers, ears, teeth, and bones. Shopkeepers might display small body parts in their windows, and photographers might sell picture postcards of the event. Even as the newspapers published detailed accounts from the mouths of eyewitnesses, the coroner or his jury would name the cause of death as at the hands of persons unknown. That's insane. So you literally have a picture of a dead black man hanging from the tree, and the coroner comes and the jury comes and all of the officials of the law come and they say, we don't know who did it. As Black Bishop Henry McNeil Turner observed in 1893, the local papers can advance what they are going to do, how and when it was done, how the rope broke, how many balls entered the Negro's body, how loud he prayed, how piteously he begged, what he said, how long he was left hanging, how many composed the mob, the number that were massed, whether they were prominent citizens or not, how the fire was built that burnt the raper, how the Negro was tied, how he was thrown into the fire, and the whole transaction. But still, the fiendish work was done by a set of unknown men. The unrecorded or silenced voices of the victims, along with the deliberate anonymity of lynchers, makes it difficult to recreate historical events. When the victim is dead and silent and the murderer is alive and at large, Frederick Douglass observed in 1892, the killer can tell any story he may please and will be believed. In the words of Ida B. Wells, dead men tell no tales and living ones will not voluntarily do so when it means an exposure of their crimes. Beginning about the last decade of the century, white Southerners began to tell themselves and each other powerful stories about Black men and white women, stories that invariably expounded upon the twin themes of rape and lynching, and that continued to equate Black men's political power with sexual transgressions across the color line. In an effort to maintain the rigid racial categories of Black and white that were vital to racial hierarchy, whites argued as well for the purity of white women in a way that began to cut more thoroughly across class lines. All of these narratives reveal an alarmingly vituperative strain of racism, a monstrous incarnation of pro-slavery thought. At the same time, Black Southerners and their Northern allies called attention to the political purposes of lynching. A few outspoken Black Southerners also told entirely different stories about Black men and white women, for in spite of the convictions of white apologists that a consensual liaison between a Black man and a white woman was an impossibility, documents reveal that such liaisons continued to form in the decades after Reconstruction. Anti-lynching protesters drew on this fact and accordingly offered their own interpretations of white violence in the late 19th-century South. Very interesting stuff right here. I have to look up this word, vituperative. I've never seen that word, and it looks like a cool word, honestly. Vituperative. Bitter and abusive is the definition. So a bitter and abusive type of racism began to form after the end of slavery, essentially saying, continuing on with the thought that, before the end of slavery, relationships between Black men and white women were somewhat tolerated because the rigid pyramid of patriarchy was upheld through white male violence in the form of slavery over Black men and Black women, and in rigid patriarchy that they enforced through violence against women, right? So a few Black men and a few white women having sex here and there, or even having children or getting married, didn't threaten that rigid pyramid. But after the end of slavery, when the whole social order is upended, then it becomes we need to enforce patriarchy through more explicit forms of violence. Let's continue here. The agency of white women. There were cases in the late 19th century South in which there had been no contact whatsoever between the alleged victim of rape and the victim of a lynching. Still, Black anti-lynching protesters did not proclaim the innocence of every Black man accused of raping a white woman. Frederick Douglass maintained that he had never raised a finger or uttered a word in defense of anyone really guilty of the dreadful crime now in question. Ida B. Wells knew that individual Negroes commit crimes the same as do white men. Protesters focus solely on the injustice of lynching and on the notion that the Negro race is peculiarly given to assault upon women. Wells noted that after a man was lynched, there would always be doubts as to his guilt, whereas there would be no doubt whatever as to the guilt of those who murdered and tortured and burned alive this victim of their bloodlust. Alternatively, then, the white woman could be a transgressor against the patriarchs of her family and community, taking cover under the cloak of victimization when discovered. If her parents, husband, or other relatives had been unaware of her illicit liaison with a black man, they could do the work for her, assuming her to be prey and then presenting her as such without dissent. If the family had suspected or known of illicit behavior, they could bury that knowledge in criminal charges, again with the woman's consent. The categories of consent and rape may in fact have been confused to the woman herself, especially after being held before her family and community as a violated female. As victim, she could in some measure be exalted. Refusal to cooperate could also result in violence at the hands of white patriarchs. I mean, that just reminds me of Rosewood. I mean, famously in that movie, this white woman got abused by this white man. She was transgressing against her husband by cheating on cheating on her husband with some other rando white dude. She walks outside, and instead of facing up to the fact that she's going to be punished for her transgression, she blames it on the random black man, some big cold black Negro out there, and ends up causing Rosewood to be burned in the movie, right? And of course, that's partially based on the true story of Rosewood. Let's continue here. Part of the problem lay in the fact that whites now more often claimed consensual sex between a black man and a white woman to be unimaginable, expounding upon white women's revulsion at the thought. Wealth, character, abilities, accomplishments, and position have no effect to modify this aversion of the white woman to a Negro marital alliance. Alabama Senator and former Confederate General John T. Morgan reported in 1890, adding that the snows will fall from heaven in sooty blackness sooner than the white woman of the United States will consent to the maternity of Negro families. Frederick Douglass dispensed with such pronouncements, pointing out that if the thing is impossible to happen, no one should be afraid that it will happen. Although some blacks defied whites by supporting marriage across the color line, others responded with disdain to such liaisons. "We don't want any white wives," Virginia editor John Mitchell announced. "Colored ones are good enough for us." John Edward Bruce, a journalist who had been born a slave in Maryland, made a note to himself in the corner of a letter from another black band that read, "A foxy half-breed and troublemaker professional Negro, for revenue only, married a second-rate white woman." Okay. By the way, when he says foxy half breed, Martha Hodes in a previous chapter, I think it was around chapter 5 or 6, she talks about how, we don't exactly know how some of these black men who were having sex with white women looked, right? And there was one instance where one of the black men who was accused of having sex with a white woman was referred to as a white slave, meaning that he was so light-skinned, people might have assumed he was white, and he might have even passed as white. But because the community knew him as a Negro, they knew that his lineage went back to that. And in America, we have that one drop rule. He couldn't just, say he was white and then go about his life and do whatever he wanted to do. So, when he says foxy half-breed, I think what he's trying to allude to there is that many of the black men who were having sex with white women were partially white themselves or very light-skinned brothers. We don't exactly know, but that goes to show how race is like a social construct, right? I mean, in Brazil, any one drop of white blood makes you white. In America, doesn't matter how much white blood you have. If you have black blood in you, even one drop, you're black, right? So it's once again, race is not real. It's absolutely ridiculous. All right, let's continue here. The ever-present threat of lynching prescribed consensual liaisons between black men and white women in the late 19th century South. With the Southern white woman, Ida B. Wells wrote in 1895, "Any mesalliance existing between a white woman and a colored man is a sufficient foundation for the charge of rape." Wells believed that 4/5 of the cases of so-called assault of white women by black men would be called adultery, were it not for the factor of race. There were, however, instances in which families could not cover over the transgressions of a white woman. Such cases, though rare, when Ida Wells published her list of alleged causes for lynching, only a handful out of hundreds appeared under the headings of miscegenation, shed light on the dynamics of sexual liaisons between black men and white women in the post-Reconstruction South. Exactly why a white woman or her family would be unable to conceal an illicit liaison by conjuring rape charges remains obscure. The story of Ida Abercrombie and Peter Stamps in a small town west of Atlanta in Georgia's Upper Piedmont reveals possible complications. Peter Stamps, a married black man in his 40s with 7 children, worked for James M. Abercrombie, a white man from a prominent local family. A Civil War veteran and member of the Baptist Church, Abercrombie owned a mill and brickyard and played an active role in county development and local Democratic politics. After rape charges were brought against Stamps, the newspapers described him as a large black Negro. On a summer night in 1885, Stamps was arrested at the Abercrombie farm and taken to jail. Hundreds gathered as the details of the alleged crime leaked out, and by the next afternoon, a mob of 500 was ready to swing the Negro from a tree. Into the night, the town was wild, its streets clogged with white people discussing the terrible story. The men carried shotguns, marginally disguising themselves with hats and bandanas. To no avail, the sheriff apparently tried to avoid the gathering forces, but the mob, perhaps 50, perhaps 400, caught up and in the middle of the night hanged Stamps from a bridge railing in the center of town. People then vanished, but by daybreak returned to observe the suspended body. If the papers are to be believed, the crowd moved back as Peter Stamp's wife stared at her husband, cradling her newborn in her arms. The morning train was crammed with white sightseers hoping for a glimpse of the dead man. Not surprisingly, before the jury turned Stamp's body over to his wife, they pronounced that he had been hanged by unknown parties. What Peter Stamps had done was called revolting, disgusting, and deplorable, and it involved a white girl just 13 years old. Ida Abercrombie was the daughter of Stamps' well-to-do employer and pretty as a picture. She had a wreath of golden hair, drooping lashes, and evenly shaped features. She was a good student, the idol of her home, and the favorite of all who knew her. And yet, although, according to the papers, not one word of evil had ever been spoken against Ida Abercrombie, Peter Stamps was not charged with rape. The story was bigger than that. In the summer of 1885, Ida's stepmother could no longer ignore her suspicions that the child was pregnant. This discovery, which shocked her, was never named directly. When grown-ups questioned Ida, her answers were both perplexing and frightening. James Abercrombie immediately sent for 2 doctors who confirmed the stepmother's suspicions. When questioned a second time, the girl told a most shocking story. It seemed that on a winter's night 7 months earlier, Peter Stamps had caught her at the farmhouse, and that at subsequent times the same act had been repeated. Grieving and ashamed, the father was assisted by friends who advised the instant arrest of the Negro. Before that could happen, however, Ida Abercrombie and Peter Stamps allegedly met one more time. A few nights later, Ida informed her father that she was going to die, and a quarter of an hour later, she expired. This time, the doctors determined that Ida had died of poisoning. It was after Ida's funeral that white people began to gather in the streets of Douglasville. Okay, interesting. So, all right, it's not okay for a 40-year-old man to have sex with a 13-year-old, girl of any race at any time. Like, that's not okay. It's not okay for a 40-year-old man to be cheating on his wife with a 13-year-old daughter of his boss. That is not okay under any circumstances, right? I think, though, we also have to remember, like, at that time, late 19th century, girls were getting married at 15, 16 to much older men, right? It was still common back then for your first wife to die, giving birth to your 3 or 4 children, then you remarry, right? I mean, that was just the way life was back then. And, it was a very different time. So that's that thing. What Peter did, if he consensually had sex with this girl, I would frown on it. But it sounds like they had a twisted, consensual relationship. Ida got pregnant from this sexual relationship with this much older black man who was cheating on his wife. And then she ended up committing suicide because of the social, social pressure, right? The trauma that she knew she was about to endure. Her and her child were about to endure. They were probably going to either kill the child or not probably kill her, but definitely kill this man, and she didn't want to feel guilty about it. That's what it sounds like. Anyway, The public story, relayed by white voices about Ida Abercrombie, was thereafter a story about purity. Ida's response to the inquiring adults had been innocent answers. She had no conception of what had transpired, had displayed complete ignorance of the great wrong done her, and though she did a great sin, she was sinless. In short, Ida had been too pure-minded to know her sin. The girl's death could not possibly have been suicide, for Ida had not realized her sin. Rather, Peter Stamps had handed the poison to Ida just before his arrest, telling her that it would hide her shame. The few white folks who held out for suicide concluded that Ida had sought peace in death. With a hint of puzzlement, an Atlanta Constitution reporter added, "It seems strange that a girl with a bright mind at her age should be so deluded, but no other story will ever be believed by the people of Douglasville." Any such doubts were cleared in the white newspaper's obligatory final statement. While the people very much regret the circumstances causing the lynching and the necessity for it, and do not openly advocate lawlessness, still they tacitly approve of what was done. As for Peter Stamp's version, the girl reported that his confession was identical with the story of the girl. He had been kind to Ida Abercrombie when she was little, thereby winning her confidence. He denied having overcome the girl, and he denied the poisoning. There is no other record of his voice. The vagueness and unreliability of the accounts make it difficult to discern the nature of the liaison between Ida and Abercrombie and Peter Stamps. Because the family did not bring rape charges, it seems likely that it was in some measure consensual and that other people knew of the consensual liaison, although in theory this should not have precluded a false accusation. Perhaps Ida's visible pregnancy at 7 months had helped Stamps on this point. Perhaps townspeople knew that the circumstances were rather different from what the papers reported, and that the news story intended simply as a record for outsiders and posterity. Ida Wells would later uncover lynching accounts in which the victim's age was revised far downward, but this was not the case here. Census records confirm that Ida Abercrombie was 13 in 1885. Perhaps she was a lonely or abused young woman who took refuge in Peter Stamps, who in turn took advantage of her. Perhaps she was a rebellious youth and never recorded gossip contradicting the newspaper account raged for weeks or months following the lynching. Perhaps a local black community knew the real story. Perhaps her father and stepmother had known of the liaison but cared to say nothing unless word got out, in the interest of preserving the family's reputation. Perhaps Peter Stamps was a valuable or irreplaceable laborer in the Abercrombie business. Records indicate that although he was an agricultural worker, he may have also been a skilled blacksmith. Perhaps Ida's father and stepmother simply did not care. Much about the liaison remains elusive, yet the response of the white family reveals that at least in the mid-1880s, whites were unable to present every liaison between a black man and a white woman, or even a white girl, as unequivocal rape. The Stamps-Abercrombie affair demonstrates that even when whites acknowledge such a liaison to be in some measure consensual, the woman could still be considered innocent and the black man murdered for the mutual transgression. Two briefer cases shed a dim beam of light on the circumstances that led to the lynching of Peter Stamps. In the Virginia Piedmont in 1880, Arthur Jordan was taken from jail by a mob of perhaps 50 men in the middle of the night, tied, gagged, and hanged from a tree in a nearby cemetery. The coroner's jury determined that Jordan had died at the hands of parties unknown, though people seem to agree that the men came from Nathan Corder's neighborhood. The charge against Jordan was not rape, but rather seduction, abduction, influencing, and in some versions marrying the white Elvira Corder, the 25-year-old daughter of Nathan. Jordan, a married man, lived with the Corders as a laborer for 2 years before he and Elvira tried to run away together. The two were caught in Maryland, where Jordan was arrested and brought back to a Virginia jail. Perhaps it was the too public nature of the liaison, including the attempt to escape together, that precluded rape charges. Such local knowledge may thus have figured as well in the case of Peter Stamps and Ida Abercrombie. Another clue lies in the description of Elvira. Although she was an attractive and respectable girl, she was also of weak intellect, half-witted, and of unsound mind. In such cases, whites may have felt it necessary to describe daughters from respective families as not entirely responsible for their own actions. In fact, although reporters described Ida Abercrombie as smart and studious, the overall effect conveyed nearly the opposite. A young girl so naive as to border on feeble-minded. I mean, parents still do that now today. If you have a kid or whatever and your kid gets in trouble with the law or something, the parents will come to court or write a letter or something and say, Johnny's a good boy, but sometimes he can be a little hot-headed, or Johnny's always been a great student, but he's always had a problem with authority, and he's never been the sharpest with emotional intelligence, or something like that, right? Like, parents still do that today, right? But it seems to be, in the book Afro Pessimism that we read last year, I think Frank B. Wilderson, however you say his last name, said, white women were created socially to be the perfect victims and the permanent victims, meaning that any justifiable violence in society can be done in the name of white women because they will always be the permanent and perfect innocent victims, and you can paint them as such, right? Let's continue here. Nearly a decade later, in Georgia's northern mountains in 1889, a band of disguised men broke into the home of John Duncan. They told the black man to get out of bed and pray, but before he could do so, someone fired a shot and killed him. Like Peter Stamps and Arthur Jordan, Duncan lived on the farm of a white man, and like the other two, he was described as married. Duncan had once been considered an inoffensive, harmless Negro until it came to light that a white woman lived in the same house with him and his children. The identity of the white woman was never revealed and her character never assessed, but the two were clearly cohabiting, and for this the man was lynched. Perhaps then, at least some whites in the Abercrombie's neighborhood had understood the newspaper account of the Stamps lynching as at least in part invented. Very interesting. I think also, they might have, because once again, any drop of black blood makes somebody black in America, no matter how light skinned you are. So they could have saw his wife one day, who might have been a very light skinned black woman, and said, oh, he's living with a white woman, right? If you remember in the movie Rosewood, the white guys were over there talking about Don Cheadle's character. I forgot the name of Don Cheadle's character in Rosewood, but they said that Negro over there, he has a piano, and on top of that, he's married to a white woman. And the other white guys had to say, is she white? And then only one white guy out of this group said, no, she's not white. She's just mixed with Indian and Negro or something like that, right? But, I wouldn't put it past white men to be jealous of a brother back then married to a fine-ass, red-boned, light-skinned sister. All right, let's continue here. The violent revenge of white patriarchs did not always take the form of mob lynching. There were times instead when male relatives intervened individually and went on record for it. And such a case sheds another thin ray of light on consensual liaisons between black men and white women in the late 19th century South. In the East End neighborhood of Richmond, Virginia in 1897, a young black man named Paul Davis was shot as he moved from jail to courthouse to stand trial for rape. The man who intended to kill Davis was Carlos Twitchell, a white farmer of little means who had recently employed Davis and who claimed that Davis had raped his daughter, Cora. Paul Davis, who was gravely wounded by the shooting, had once lived with the Twitchell family, sharing meals and sleeping in their one-room dwelling. Cora's father was prompted to vengeance by his wife's news that his daughter was in a delicate condition due to Paul's assault. When a doctor confirmed the pregnancy, the father became nearly crazy with anger and had the black man arrested. Carlos Twitchell swore at first that his daughter was 14 when Davis raped her, but when he learned that a death sentence could be handed down for the rape of an underage girl, he changed his mind and swore that she had been 13. Cora's father justified violence the same way elite white apologists did. The idea of a man's daughter being ruined and by a N-word at that, he said, I did no more than any other man would have done. Although Richmond's black newspaper described the Twitchell family as of little or no social standing in the community, a white reporter called Cora Twitchell the daughter of respectable white parents, indicating that the designation of respectability could have less to do with class standing and more to do with allegedly suffering rape at the hands of a black man. Just as the Atlanta papers had described Peter Stamps as a large black Negro, false pictures of Davis had been published to make him look darker. Black editor John Mitchell believed that such images had been circulated in an effort to prejudice public sentiment against him. Mitchell thus called attention to white apologist purposes in equating blackness with crimes in an effort to differentiate supposedly threatening black men from supposedly trustworthy white men. Richmond's Black Weekly told a story quite different from the one Cora Twitchell's father relayed. Under such headlines as Woman's Love, a strange infatuation of a white girl for Paul Davis, The Planet reported how the two had often walked towards school together, separating where the roads diverged to their respective destinations, and how Cora visited Paul after he had stopped working for the Twitchell family. In a rare instance of a black man's first-person account, Paul Davis told a Planet interviewer how Cora used to come over there after me, stay all day sometimes, and send notes 2 and 3 times a week, asking to meet with him. When Cora implored Paul to run away with her, he refused. I told her I couldn't go, he remembered. She said she was coming after me to go with her anyway. The girl's father tried to get her to say that I ravished her, Davis explained, and she wouldn't do it. The ensuing progression of Cora Twitchell's testimony, confessions, and refutations reveals something of the experience of a white girl pursuing a relationship with a black man in the late 19th century South. At the trial, Cora concurred with her parents that Paul Davis had raped her and that she had been underage. Ain't that a shame, man? She was the one going to this brother's house, writing love letters to him, saying, let's run away together, Paul. Let's be free. Let's go away. We can escape all of this. Let's go to Canada. And then when it's time to go to trial, she says, yeah, he raped me. Paul raped me. What? Stop. Okay. Anyway, at the trial, Cora concurred with her parents that Paul Davis had raped her and that she had been underage. Davis had first had intercourse with her in the kitchen about the middle of June 1896, she testified, and at another time in the woods when she was watching the cows. A child was born in March of the following year. Paul Davis was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Carlos Twitchell was acquitted for the shooting. But a month later, Cora changed her mind, wishing to repair the wrong I did to Davis. As she said, she went back to county officials to swear that the liaison had been consensual. One was as much to blame as the other, that she had not in fact been underage, and that she had testified from fear of my parents. But after another month passed, Cora was back refuting that confession. Everything she had said in court was true after all. I am not in the least afraid of my parents, she asserted, but rather had reversed the testimony under pressure from Paul Davis's mother, who tearfully begged Cora to do something for her son. Okay, so a part of me feels like this is like baby mama drama to the ultimate extreme. But it's also like I can understand her going back and refuting her recantation, because her mother, the mother of Paul Davis, is like, they are going to kill my black son if you continue saying like, I want to run away with your black lover. And even though you have his child, and that's my grandchild, right? I don't think this is safe for any of us. They will kill the baby, kill you, and kill my son, is what Paul Davis's mother is saying. Continuing here. Evidence, however, points to the truth of parental pressure and coercion. The lawyer who defended Paul Davis contended that Cora had visited his office after the trial. I want you to get Paul Davis out of jail, Cora had commanded, explaining, it is my fault that he is in there. She then invited a scenario in accordance with her own wishes. I was engaged to be married to him, she stated, and we intended to run away and be married, if mother had not found out how matters stood between us. Cora then confided that she had left home in fear that she would be either killed or cruelly beaten or driven from home by my parents. Cora's mother herself later visited the lawyer in a towering passion and a violent rage. Moreover, Paul's mother told her own story of how Cora had come to her home to apologize, offering hopes that the new information she had given would do Paul good. On the strength of this evidence, Paul Davis was granted a new trial and then set free when the state declined to prosecute any further. Shout out to Paul Davis. He beat the odds. He beat the odds. Preserved with the court testimony is a packet of letters from Cora Twitchell to Paul Davis, written as her pregnancy was advancing. Though brief and cryptic, these notes offer a rare glimpse of emotions. The girl's affection was apparent. I would like to see you before you go, she wrote one day. but I do not want you to go, for I will be alone. Stay home for me. I am afraid I might not see you anymore. In another letter, she wrote jealously, did you have a good time with that girl you was telling me about? I know you want to see her again. But the letters also reveal Cora's futile determination to extract promises from Paul in the face of her dire circumstances and illuminate the potentially coercive powers of a white woman in the post-Reconstruction South. I want to see you Sunday, and you know where we was before. Okay, she's writing like an old slave. Funny, the white woman is the only one in this book who's writing like an old slave. I want to see you Sunday, and you know where we was before, she told her lover. Do not forget what you told me you would do. Every letter contained some such instructions, though Paul Davis clearly held his own. I want you to stay with me Sunday, for I will be alone, she wrote another time. Do as I tell you. About 9 o'clock, I will be up you know where. Only once did Cora allude more directly to pregnancy, expressing fear that her mother would find it out, and begging Paul, don't show this to no one. Cora had apparently told her mother about Paul's intimacy with her. Once she was questioned, and some believe that her father knew of the intimacy as well. The knowledge may have been more widespread, for Cora stated that no one complained to her parents because she associated with a colored person. In an echo of antebellum cases, it was only with the birth of a child to prove the liaison that the white family took action. Carlos Twitchell's attempt at violent revenge failed, and with a defiant daughter, he could not invoke purity and respectability to rally local forces behind him. Perhaps then, in the case of Ida Abercrombie and Peter Stamps, Ida's father and stepmother, too, had begged her to confirm rape charges to no avail. Although the wealthy and admired Abercrombies were able to invoke the veil of purity even in the absence of rape charges, remember that Ida had sinned but remained innocent. The poor Twitchell family could not make that leap. Neither Ida Abercrombie nor Cora Twitchell had played their proper roles as white women. Yet Ida's case standing allowed her to retain the chivalric protection of white men. But this was also possible because Ida was dead. Cora, in contrast, was a troublemaking white woman with an illegitimate black child in her arms. And while Peter Stamps had been silenced and killed, Paul Davis remained alive and gave his own story to the press. It is not entirely out of the question that it is not entirely out of the question then that Ida Abercrombie's own father had poisoned her in order to silence his daughter and tell the story his own way. That story included memorializing Ida Abercrombie as a pure and innocent white girl. Very interesting. So we have to remember, there's many intersections in this book. There's the intersection of, black oppression by white male patriarchs, but there's also the oppression of white women by white male patriarchs as well. And throughout this entire book, we've seen instances where white men not only take out violence and oppression against black men, but also inflicted on white women to uphold the system of patriarchy, more so after the end of slavery than before. And very interesting that a father would murder his own daughter after she had sex with a Negro and got pregnant by him, given, the Negro was like 3 times her age, right? But still, murdered his own daughter because what if his daughter actually wanted to be with that Negro man? What if she was going to continue to cause trouble in telling the story? They ask her as she gets older and she says, you know what, I wanted to have that relationship or something like that. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, Ida was killed, and so they took revenge out on the black man because a white woman's life was taken. Cora was still alive and going back and forth with how she talked about her relationship with Paul Davis. And, Paul Davis was set free. Very interesting. Very interesting. Let's continue here. Clues to consensual liaisons between black men and white women at the end of the century are scarce. On occasion, white women spoke out to prevent lynching, but the circumstances remained shrouded. In the Tennessee mountains around the turn of the century, a freedman named Alf Cannon and a white servant woman had a child. When a mob came for Cannon, the woman declared herself at fault with more courage than Cora Twitchell, convincing the white men that Cannon didn't rape her. Cannon's former masters drove off the mob. Alf Cannon was an angry loner with a few friends, and the entire incident was later mentioned only rarely and with the direst warnings about secrecy. But for every white woman who crossed her male relatives by remaining silent like Ida Abercrombie, by attempting to run away like Elvira Corder, by cohabitating with a black man like John Duncan's anonymous partner, by trying feebly to speak forthrightly like Cora Twitchell, or by contradicting a mob like Alf Cannon's lover, hundreds of others consented to fables about rape. Here was a significant change from the antebellum South, where white relatives and neighbors did not so swiftly assume or invoke sexual violence. In 1894, an anonymous North Carolinian who had left the South, described a presumably representative scenario as follows. Very frequently, a Negro will secretly visit some white woman and for a time the intercourse not be known. But should it be suspected to any extent, the safest thing for him to do would be to light out the first dark night. For he will be watched, and when found going to see his paramour, word is given and he is caught. Up to this point, this had indeed been the fate of Peter Stamps, Arthur Jordan, John Duncan, and Paul Davis. In the typical case, this nameless writer continued, the white woman denounces him as having assaulted her and proclaims her virtue and innocence. The poor darky is strung up and his voice is silenced. Although this was not precisely what had come to pass for Stamps, Jordan, Duncan, and Davis, three of those men were murdered and the fourth was meant to be. This, too, marked a significant change. According to some forthright Black anti-lynching activists in the South, the deaths of a great many other Black men fit that anonymously detailed outline perfectly. When these activists attempted to talk about the agency of white women in liaisons with Black men, the consequences were extremely grave. Interesting. Water break. All right. Alternative stories about lynching. Ida B. Wells was the most outspoken of these activists, but she was neither the first nor the last to offer stories about white women's voluntary participation in sexual liaisons with Black men and their subsequent capitulations to lynchers. Sometime in the mid-1880s, an obscure Black newspaper out of Atlanta, Georgia, carried the following editorial. The constant reports of white women in the South being raped by colored men has become a stale old lie. It does seem that a great many of them get off in lonesome places with colored men in a surprising degree. This is a sort of predestination, but there seems to be a great spirit of watchfulness on the part of the white man, who somehow don't seem to trust their white sisters with the Negro. These white girls want watching as well as the Negroes. The whole thing looks like a partnership business until somebody is caught. The writer here likely knew at least a few cases in which Black men have been lynched for partnerships with white women, and he felt the need to bring the possibility of such scenarios to light. But if this editor was too obscure to reach many white readers, this was not the case for the politically active Jesse Duke of Alabama. Jesse C. Duke, a leader in both the Republican Party and the Black Baptist Church, had witnessed a brutal lynching in the summer of 1887. The alleged crime was rape, and Duke addressed himself to the subject in his own weekly, the Montgomery Herald. Every day or so we read of the lynching of some Negro for the outraging of some white woman, began his editorial. Shifting the burden from Black men to white women, he asked, why is it that white women attract Negro men now more than former days? Duke offered his own interpretation of this change. There was a time when such a thing was unheard of, he wrote. There is a secret to this thing, and we greatly suspect it is the growing appreciation of the white Juliets for the colored Romeo, as he becomes more and more intelligent and refined. Duke struck here at the hearts of white fears that independent Black men would achieve so-called social equality. If Duke thought that white people did not read his paper or would pay little attention if they did, he was wrong. I mean, that's how I feel on this channel, right? Like when I do the book direct series, when I release anything, I generally say whatever I want because I feel like nobody's going to see it. Nobody's going to care. You know, this is still a small, relatively obscure YouTube channel where I get to do whatever I want. And I'm greatly appreciative of that, right? And this guy, Duke, is like, hey, I'm writing for this small, little local paper in Alabama. I think only the Black folks will read it. Hey, and let me write this. I think these white girls are starting to like these handsome brothers who are getting richer, smarter, and starting to ball. And the white folks lose their mind because you never know who's watching. You never know who's watching. Anyway, so the outcry was swift and angry. 75 whites attended a public meeting and passed a resolution declaring Duke's words an intolerable insult. Another resolution declared Duke himself a vile and dangerous character who seems bent on inculcating doctrines among his race that are a menace to society and to every white woman in the land. Yet another called him a scoundrel who had crossed the limit of toleration. More than 200 white men signed the declarations, giving Duke 8 hours to leave town or take the consequences. Either fortuitously or speedily, Duke had departed for a Sunday school convention, and his wife could not or would not reveal his whereabouts. When word came that he had been spotted in a restaurant, a delegation rushed to bully him, only to find him gone. A committee of 10 met each train at the station to no avail. White leaders proffered Duke's words in an effort to halt the construction of a recently approved black college in Montgomery. We deprecate any further efforts being made to introduce any such educated Romeos in our midst, they intoned. One white man saw proof in Duke's words that a schooled black man became an unmitigated fool with unparalleled effrontery, prompting him to ask, what state had the honor of educating this brute? Irate whites continued, a sharp lookout for Duke through the night and into the following day, as more than 100 people again gathered to put a stop to the college. So this is a shame. So this brother right here becomes educated, and then they do this typical tactic that white folks do and basically white supremacists do, and unfortunately some black people do. They say when black people get educated, they become educated fools. They become sick in the head. They become twisted, right? And they don't know what's good for themselves, and they don't know what's good for their race, all that sort of stuff, right? So this brother basically just wrote a simple idea that maybe women are attracted to educated, tall, dark, and handsome brothers, right? And the white folks lose their mind, and they use that as an excuse to not build a new university for black students in the area of Alabama, right? So absolutely a shame that we the anti-intellectualism in America is real, and especially it's considered dangerous to be an educated black man, right? And that's why we read these books on this live stream. We read these books because there's nothing more dangerous than a black man who can read, and a black man who enjoys reading, and a black man who tries to share the joy of reading with his people. Let's continue here. Although white reporters commented smugly on the orderliness of these events, with descriptions of seemingly quiet meetings and issuing thoughtful resolutions, the response of the black community belies that version. Prominent black men in Montgomery called their own meeting not to protest, but to figure out how to best to protect themselves from white fury. The convener, James Hale, presented whites with a statement, disclaiming sympathy with Duke or his paper and condemning, in the strongest terms, the offending commentary. Whites targeted other prominent black men too. A lawyer suspected of prior knowledge of the editorial was handed train fare and told to leave in all possible haste, assuring his enemies that he had nothing to do with Duke's article. This man also revealed very ill and unpleasant treatment at the hands of some of our white citizens. Whites next accused a black doctor of preaching that the Negro is as good as the white man and should assert himself, forcing the man to offer an emphatic disclaimer of any connection with Duke. Though it was never reported in the newspapers, the white man also pounded on the door of the Duke home and broke windows as his wife and children took refuge in the cellar. White Alabama newspapers spewed forth venom. One described Jesse Duke as the insolent Negro whose foul insult excused the outraging of white women by Negroes. To let him escape without at least a tarring and feathering would constitute violence to the women of Montgomery and the entire country. And readers were warned, your wife, your sister, and your daughter are objects of this animal's attack. Another editor added formal politics to the brew, noting that Duke came from the class of Negroes that the Republicans sought to force upon the South during Reconstruction, adding, no wonder the whites became solid for democracy. And by democracy, I believe they mean the Democratic Party. So finally, a white man wrote to endorse a swift reaction to Duke's editorial. You will preserve the purity and integrity of your race if you have to kill every Negro that exists in your midst, he cheered. In the middle of the night, a black messenger delivered Duke's apology to the offices of the white newspaper. His editorial had been unfortunate and he had intended no offense. He said he was very sorry indeed and would never do such a thing anymore, reminding his tormentors of his status as a poor man with a family to support. Duke signed off very respectfully. The presses of Duke's Montgomery Herald were spared from destruction only because they were owned by a white man. So I'm not mad at Mr. Duke here for apologizing because, it's very likely at that time that the whites then might have went on a rampage and just murdered every black man they saw, right? And burnt the whole town down just because his brother wrote a letter. So, in the interest of self-preservation for his family, himself, and his people, he said, you know what, let me just apologize, right? Like, of course, the whites are going to overreact, and let me just do the right thing in this case. So I'm not mad at him for it, but today we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be kowtowing to threats of violence from the white supremacists, in my opinion. Let's continuing. Let's keep continuing here. When the commotion died down after several days, it remained certain that Duke must stay away. The family left Alabama for Arkansas. Oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't go to Arkansas. Anyway, the family left Alabama for Arkansas, where Jesse Duke continued his career in journalism. From outside the state, he sent a letter to Montgomery, both disavowing any intention of maligning white women and denouncing journalistic intolerance. Duke claimed that he had written the editorial in a state of impassioned indignation at the repeated and increasing lynching of my race. The Reverend T.W. Coffey of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who edited a newspaper out of Birmingham, subsequently defended Jesse Duke with the question, is it not possible that white women could love colored men? What is there inhuman about this? Jesse Duke, T.W. Coffey, and the editor of the obscure Atlanta newspaper understood the possibility of consensual sex between black men and white women in the post-Reconstruction South, but whites would not hear it. In the early 1890s, Ida B. Wells, co-editor and part owner of Memphis's Black Weekly newspaper, embarked on a mission to tell the world about consenting white women. Wells, born a slave in Mississippi during the war, investigated more than 700 lynchings, published her findings in a black-owned New York newspaper and a 15-cent pamphlet financed by Northern black women, and became the foremost anti-lynching activist in the United States. She criticized racist whites and silent blacks, took her campaign to England, and remained a pioneer of the anti-lynching crusade until well into the 20th century, especially following the death of Frederick Douglass in 1895. Her investigations brought to light liaisons between black men and white women that had been, in her words, voluntary, clandestine, and illicit. In 1892, Wells published a now famous editorial in her Memphis Free Speech. Nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women, she wrote. If Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves and public sentiment will have a reaction. A conclusion will then be reached, which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. Memphis whites, basically what she's trying to say is like, if y'all continue to just accuse black men of rape and willy-nilly just continue to to murder black men, it might come out actually that, a lot of white women are just attracted to black men, right? And you'll be embarrassed because you can't continue to level false accusations against a group of people. Even if we live under the system of white supremacy, even if you can murder us in impunity, the truth will come out, right? And that, I believe Ida might have been a bit naive to think that, as if the truth matters to white supremacists, like as if anything matters to them other than their own desire for power and dominance over others. But still, the truth was eventually going to come out that, people are attracted to people regardless of race, because why? Race is not real. And people just like big dick balling motherfuckers. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, let's continue here. Memphis whites were as incensed as Montgomery whites had been 5 years before, and whether on purpose or by chance, Wells was up north when the piece ran. This time, there was no pretense of order. White people called a meeting and burned the presses. They threatened Wells's life and kept watch over incoming trains in Wells's home. One editor warned of no mercy for the Negro rapist and little patience with his defenders. Another, who assumed the editorial's author to be male, suggested castration. Tie the wretch who utters these calumnies to a stake. he directed, and perform upon him a surgical operation with a pair of tailor's shears. Wells never returned home. Her business manager fled, and whites assaulted a black man who had once owned the paper, forcing him at gunpoint to sign a statement condemning the words as slander on white women. Ida, by the way, how dumb are the white supremacists to see that somebody's name is Ida and assume it's a man? Last time I checked, Ida is not a unisex name. Ida Wells continued her reporting from the North, where she worked for T. Thomas Fortune's black newspaper, the New York Age. Like Jessie Duke before her, Wells placed the burden of agency on white women. There were many white women in the South, Wells declared, who would marry colored men if they could do so without shame. White men lynched the offending Afro-American, she wrote, not because he is a despoiler of virtue, but because he succumbs to the smiles of white women. The facts alone, Wells believed, would defend the Afro-American Samsons who suffered themselves to be betrayed by white Delilahs. Relentlessly, Wells sounded the theme of mutuality. I'll repeat. Relentlessly, Wells sounded the theme of mutuality. Why should it be impossible to believe that white women guilty of the same crime for which Southern white men are notorious? Wells asked in the early 1890s. In numerous instances where colored men have been lynched on the charge of rape, she wrote in 1895, it was positively known at the time of lynching and indisputably proven after the victim's death that the relationship sustained between the man and the woman was voluntary and clandestine. Lynchers knew this all too well, she contended. Such cases are not rare, Wells insisted, but the press and people conversant with the facts almost invariably suppress them. Employing the strategy that whites were best condemned with their own words, Ida Wells gathered much of her information from the white press, often quoting verbatim. In Memphis alone, Wells unearthed 6 voluntary liaisons between black men and white women. In one, a white woman named Sarah Clark loved a black man and lived openly with him. When indicted for miscegenation, the woman swore in court that she was not a white woman, thereby absolving herself. In another, a white woman living on Poplar Street was discovered in intimate relations with a black man named Will Morgan. The woman helped Morgan escape to the north and joined him there. In another, the 17-year-old white Lily Bailey ran away from home only to end up in the women's refuge, where she gave birth to a child whose father was black. Bailey refused to reveal the father's identity, moving one white reporter to speculate on some very nauseating details in the story of her life. In other Memphis cases, black men were lynched for liaisons they claimed had been voluntary. Just before Richard Neal was lynched in front of 200 people, for example, he warned other black men away from the blandishments of white women. According to a report in a white paper, the alleged rape victim, Mrs. Jack White, asked the constable to no avail if he could not save the Negro's life. So yeah, even though it was very dangerous for black men and white women to be having those relationships at the time, it still happened, right? White women were still getting pregnant, right? Not a lot, but it was still happening. They were running away, giving birth to multiracial children in the North, or, trying to disavow their parents. And black men were still getting lynched for that. And black men, either at the point of the gun or just from their own minds, were telling other black men, don't do it, get out, leave Becky alone. Dr. Umar went back in time and said, it's a snow bunny crisis, and was telling the black men, don't do it. Don't do it. You can get in trouble. Blandishments. I've never heard that word. This brother was about to get lynched, and the only word he could think of was blandishments. Stay away from the blandishments of white women. That if I was about to get lynched, the last word I would not say is blandishments. Anyway, let's continue here. What was true of Memphis, Wells felt sure, was true of the entire South. In Natchez, Mississippi, a well-to-do white woman named Mrs. Marshall delivered a child whose complexion gave pause to family and friends before the baby was traced to some brunette ancestor. Our ancestors are Italian, I mean, the Italians, they're dark skinned. Traced to some brunette ancestor. When the second baby was too dark, The second baby was too dark. The Marshall's coachman left town, and Mrs. Marshall followed soon thereafter. In Indianola, Mississippi, the papers reported a lynching for the rape of the sheriff's 8-year-old daughter. According to Wells' investigation, the daughter was more than 18 years old and was found by her father in this man's room, who was a servant on the place. In a case of the Arkansas-Texas border, an investigation into the lynching of Edward Coy determined that the white woman had been a willing partner and publicly reported and generally known to have been criminally intimate with the man for more than a year. Thus, Ida Wells concludes that there was hardly a town in the South free of a well-known liaison between a black man and a white woman. For each case, Wells reported with confidence she must have been stymied by a great many others. In one instance, she wrote, "We feel this to be a garbled report, but how can we prove it?" Wells was adamant that her declarations did not malign white women. When so accused, she reiterated that her aim was only to prove the injustice of assuming rape and the dire necessity for fair trials. Yet Wells also uncovered cases in which whites described a known relationship as rape, thereby proving the hopelessness of a fair trial. In Alabama, for example, when a white woman gave birth to a child whose father was black, Daniel Edwards was jailed and lynched in a crowd of 100. Yet the woman's mother had known that the relationship had been sustained for more than a year, and that the lynchers pinned a notice to Edwards warning black men who were too intimate with white girls, thereby acknowledging the relationship. The papers later claimed that Edwards was lynched for rape. Neither Jesse Duke nor Ida Wells elaborated on the motives of prevaricating with white women. Prevaricating white women. But let me look up that word, by the way, before I continue. Prevaricating. This is a new word. I'm seeing a lot of new words here. So far, the reading, prevaricate, speak or act in an evasive way. Okay. Prevaricate. Neither Jesse Duke nor Ida Wells elaborated on the motives of prevaricating white women, meaning white women who were acting elusive or evasive in how they spoke. But one of Wells' reports offers an important clue. In the lynching of Edward Coy in 1892, an investigation undertaken by a Chicago newspaper revealed the white woman had been paraded as a victim of violence and compelled by threats, if not by violence, to make the charge against the victim. If white women sometimes took the initiative in claiming rape in order to save their reputations, they could also be threatened into sustaining charges of rape. That is what Cora Twitchell's father had hoped to accomplish when he discovered his daughter. That is what Cora Twitchell's father had hoped to accomplish when he discovered his daughter's liaison. Perhaps that is also what Ida Abercrombie's father had hoped to accomplish. Yet, although Cora Twitchell and Ida Abercrombie thwarted such plans, many other white women concurred in naming their black partners as rapists. Some of those women must have been coerced into concurring, and in those cases, marks of violence on their bodies were likely sustained at the hands of white fathers or husbands. Those markings could then be displayed as evidence of rape by a black man. A white woman in Virginia, for example, finally broke down and confessed that she had told her story in order to conceal her own shame, and the bruises on her throat were made by her indignant husband because of her infidelity. At Century's End, a third black activist spoke from the South about the agency of white women. Alexander Manley, who was the editor of a North Carolina black newspaper, the Wilmington Daily Record, when he penned a response to a speech given by the inflammatory white Southerner Rebecca Latimer Felton. Felton, who had grown up in a well-to-do slave-owning family, carried the figure of the subordinate but protected plantation mistress with her into the uncertainties of the post-Civil War era. When she began to lecture to rural whites in the 1890s, she expounded often upon white farm women and their fears of black men. Speaking before the Georgia Agricultural Society in 1897, Felton delivered what would become a famous announcement. If it needs lynching to protect woman's dearest possessions from the ravening human beast, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. In the summer of 1898, Alexander Manley challenged Felton's ideas about black rapists. Addressing himself to white men, Manley wrote, "You leave your goods out of doors and then complain because they are taken away. Poor white men are careless in the matter of protecting their women, especially on farms." Manley offered an alternative version of events. "Our experience among poor white people in the country," he wrote, "teaches us that the women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than are the white men with colored women. He elaborated, meetings of this kind go on for some time until the woman's infatuation or the man's boldness bring attention to them and the man is lynched for rape. Manley then broadened his narrative to include elite white women. Every Negro lynched is called a big, burly black brute, when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers. Another point. Another point. Many of the black men who were sleeping with these white women, they might have, been the products of interracial relationships themselves that were probably not as consensual between white men and black women. Continuing here. So, big burly brutes, when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers, and were not only black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is well known to all. Finally, Manley appealed to white women to tell their men that is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. Predictably, now the white reaction was instant and furious. Okay, we're starting to see a pattern. Third time's a charm. All other news, according to one observer, was crowded out to afford room for daily repetitions of the Negro editor's defamatory article. A white man declared that Manley ought to be food for catfish in Cape Fear River. A white woman invoked politics as she urged the white voter to save her sex from outrage. A Democratic spokesman later remembered how Manley's words went like wildfire from house to house, particularly in the rural districts. The women and their husbands were righteously indignant. The timing of Manley's editorial, less than 3 months prior to North Carolina's 1898 election, caused an explosion. 4 years earlier, a fusion of Republicans and populists had put the Democrats out of power, and the party was determined to regain control with as much violence as necessary. Here, the conflation of black men's political rights with sexual transgressions across the color line reached perhaps its highest pitch of the century. Manley's assessment of white women's agency soon became central to white supremacist Democrats in statewide campaigns, and Democratic newspapers reprinted 100,000 copies of the editorial for the upcoming election. One of North Carolina's major papers led the attack, thundering, "Read the following, white men of North Carolina, and see one of the effects of Russellism and Butlerism in your state," referring to Republican Governor Daniel Russell and populist Senator Marion Butler. In case the meaning was lost on any reader, the paper explained, "Republican rule bears the fruits of insult and outrage to white women of the South, always and everywhere that it gains control of the southern states." The most sensational headline summarized Manley's editorial as follows: "White women slandered. A leading Negro Republican newspaper excuses rapists, declares that attractive white girls of culture fall in love with Negroes, and the assaults committed are the result of mutual love and not of violence. The poor white women are charged with secret meetings with Negro men and with being infatuated with them." The chain of events was a severe setback for black and white Republicans and populists, who saw at once what a terrible political blunder had been made, and took pains to assure whites that they considered the editorial base libel, and Manley an irresponsible upstart. Manley also made enemies among Wilmington's leading black citizens, a number of whom hoped he would cease publication for the sake of peace. One black government official thought that the editorial lost the two parties 25,000 votes among the poorer whites who were slandered. In the days before the election of 1898, a story appeared in a Democratic newspaper that intertwined sex and politics at every turn. Maggie Brewer, a white woman married to a prominent white farmer, had run away from her home in Chapel Hill with a black man named Manley McCauley, the family's hired laborer. The paper informed readers that Maggie had been brought up by a Republican farmer who associated with black people, and that Maggie's husband was a Republican who had been hanging around among the Negroes. The reporter warned fellow Democrats and white people that this was an index of how things will be if Negroes are allowed to predominate, using the occasion to urge Democrats to vote for white supremacy. Indeed, Maggie's white husband announced that in the future he will vote the Democratic ticket, for he had realized in his own home the horrible effects of the social equality teachings of the Republican Party. That's hilarious. Okay, the story's political twist may have been fabricated, but a search party captured the couple, and 2 days before the election, the body of Manley McCauley was found hanging from a tree. Around the same time, a white Wilmington paper ran a story about a black man who reportedly told a white woman that he would be her fellow. The editors warned that the greatest forbearance preventing a lynching of this brute and named the fusionist politicians as the cause of black men thinking themselves as good as the poor white man. The lynching of Alexander Manly was averted in part by Wilmington's black police officers, but white leaders were also eager to keep the volatile issue of the editorial, and therefore Manly himself, alive throughout the campaign. Manly had no choice but to smooth over his militant statements as the election approached. The whole trouble at Wilmington was caused by the misconstruction of an article in my paper, he announced in the fall. Flaming mutilations of this article were published all through the South, and I was charged with slandering the virtue of white women. Such a thought never entered my head. Rebecca Felton was quick with a doubly violent rejoinder, blaming the political rights of black men for trembling and afraid white women and exclaiming, "When you take the Negro into your embraces on election day to control his vote and make him believe he is a man and your brother, so long would lynching continue. The cause of lynching," Felton predicted, "will grow and increase with every election." Here she reiterated her call to action. If it requires lynching to protect women's dearest possession from ravening, drunken human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 Negroes a week, if it is necessary. Themes of race and manhood are not difficult to discern in these dialogues. While Alexander Manly criticized white men for their supposed inadequate protection of their women, you leave your goods out of doors and then complain because they are taken away. Rebecca Felton warned white men that to permit a black voter to feel like a man and your brother would incite the rape of white women. Guided by well-planned statewide corruption and violence, Democrats regained control of the state though not the city of Wilmington, in November. Just after the election, hundreds of armed white men, Wilmington's very best citizens, according to one Democrat, met to demand suspension of Manly's paper and threatened to expel Manly by force, should he not leave the county. The following day, a group of men demolished the presses and burned the building. A committee of whites forced 15 black leaders to submit their approval of the press's destruction. After that, many others had no choice but to denounce the outspoken editor. Manly left the city, and whites later blamed him for the riot. Between 10 and 20 black residents were killed. Many more were wounded, and thousands fled, their homes and property seized or destroyed by marauding whites. According to a black Baptist pastor in Wilmington, all the better class of the colored citizens were driven from the city, showing to the world that they were not after the criminal and ignorant class of Negroes, but the professional and businessmen. 2 years later, when black North Carolina Congressman George H. White refuted the idea that rape was a major cause of lynching, he was denounced by a Democratic editor for his manlyism. Decades later, a white man remembered that Manly's base slander of the white womanhood of the South had directly started the whites' uprising of 1898. You know, it's so interesting. Trump recently pardoned many of the January 6th rioters. And I was thinking about, basically how in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 or, what year this happened, right? Basically the white folks took over a town. They lost the election, but they said, no, we don't care if we lost. We're going to use violence to enforce white supremacy. I was just thinking about that the other day, and it's kind of sad, where our country is going right now. And, when we look at the history, it's sort of like repeats. I said yesterday, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes, and it's rhyming very well, like a Jay-Z song. All right. Jesse C. Duke, Ida B. Wells, and Alexander Manly, no doubt along with other more obscured black voices, told alternative stories about black men and white women in the late 19th century South, speaking in some measure for the silenced victims of lynching. At the same time that these protesters criticized white men, black anti-lynching activists also knew that those same women were crucial to the struggle. But what a tremendous influence for law and order, and what a mighty foe to mob violence Southern white women might be, wrote Mary Church Terrell in 1904. If they would arise in the purity and power of their womanhood to implore their fathers, husbands, and sons no longer to stain their hands with the black man's blood. The edge in Terrell's reference to white women's purity and power is unmistakable. In one sense, Southern white women of any class commanded power, as long as they feared black men or said that they did. as long as they consented to transforming a liaison into rape, as long as they called for the lynching of black men, the dominant narrative would retain its strength. Of course, there were white women who defied Southern patriarchs, but neither their numbers nor their power was great enough to cause the disintegration of white told tales about the rape of white women by black men. Neither were the tactics of Duke, Manley, and Wells embraced by all blacks. Some felt that the incendiary stories did more harm than good. But white listeners would most especially hear none of it, for the stories told by crusading black journalists in the post-Reconstruction South clashed with changing ideas about the purity of white women that were crucial to the larger purposes of disempowering black people after the Civil War. On the purity of white women and the danger of black men. The construction of white female purity in the post-Reconstruction South was dependent upon images of black men as bestial, and a white woman's innocence was contingent upon assault by a black man rather than a white man. At the same time, the purity of white women was also dependent upon images of black women as depraved. White constructions of black women as lustful had served slave masters' purposes, and such ideas continued to serve whites after emancipation. Black women in the late 19th century South were also the victims of lynch mobs, but more often they were subject to assault and rape by white men, a form of sexual violence that provoked neither legal nor extra-legal retribution on the part of white people. Black women figured in all kinds of derogatory ways in the stories white Southerners told about lynching in the late 19th century. Among the most common was the idea that black women were responsible for the supposed criminality of their sons and husbands. According to Philip Alexander Bruce, whose father had owned hundreds of slaves in Virginia, a black man was so accustomed to the wantonness of the women of his own race that it was no wonder he was unable to gauge the terrible character of this offense against the integrity of virtuous womanhood. A North Carolina lawyer likewise decided that the want of virtue among black women caused their men to retaliate by the commission of rape upon the white women, which is sure to be followed by a lynching. Black protesters told their own stories about the relation of black women to lynching. The founding of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896 by elite black women was prompted in part by the desire to challenge both the lynching of black men and the defamation of black women. Ida B. Wells castigated white men for a chivalry that, as she put it, confines itself entirely to the women who happen to be white. Alexander Manley mocked the hypocrisy of white men, writing, "You cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours." As activist Nanny Burroughs points out, the same man who will join a mob to lynch a Negro for committing an outrage upon a white woman will outrage a black or white woman at any time he makes up his mind so to do. Basically, even when the problem is that white women are attracted to handsome, light-skinned, tall, dark, intelligent brothers, black women still get insulted, right? Because no other group of people is insulted in America more than black women, right? In the words of our paraphrasing Malcolm X, right? And so, yeah, this echoes also what we hear today. Back then they were saying that, black men are committing these offenses against white women because black women are so loose in their community and they grew up with loose mothers and, they were taught wrong ways how to interact with women, those black men, etc. Right? So they're saying this, and then they're also pointing to this thing that's happening now. What we think about now today, many black men are accused of, becoming the Pookies and the Ray Rays and all that sort of stuff because black women, right, are these single mothers who live off food stamps and live in the ghetto and blah, 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 blah. And they raise up these black men to not know how to respect women, right? Somehow, some way, the problems of other communities are somehow laid at the feet of black women. Seems to be a repeating pattern in American discourse. Continuing here. Dominant ideas about white women, black women, and purity were part of a larger scheme of ideas that grew out of the transition from black slavery to black freedom. The racial caste system that emerged in the post-Reconstruction South was neither slavery nor equality, but rather a system of racial subordination based on an ever more rigid color line. Whites ultimately preserved racial hierarchy with the one-drop rule, whereby anyone with any known African ancestry was classified as Negro. As early as 1876, a black man had observed, "They call everybody a Negro that is as black as the ace of spades or as white as snow, if they think he is a Negro or know that he has Negro blood in his veins." Whereas the institution of slavery had satisfactorily preserved the equation of blackness and slavery, the one drop rule was the next best solution in a world that lacked legal bondage. But to preserve racial hierarchy in the absence of slavery, white people had to guard the categories of black and white, entailing more vigilant surveillance of the mixture of European and African ancestry in order to be able to tell who belonged on which side of the color line. By this logic, white men should have made sure that no black women bore their children, and some whites did worry tangentially about this phenomenon. H.S. Fulkerson, for example, expressed anxiety that white women might follow in the footsteps of their immoral brothers. Would white men yield their fair sisters to the embrace of the lustful black? He asked. If not, then let them beware of their own lust. For the most part, however, white men turned a convenient ideological somersault to justify their own access to black women, while furiously denouncing sex between black men and white women on the grounds of racial purity. In the antebellum South, the children of slave mothers and white fathers had reinforced the social order by producing enslaved children of African ancestry. In the post-Civil War South, it likewise mattered not at all if a black woman gave birth to a child of partial European ancestry, for any child born of a black woman was, according to the one-drop rule, fully black, regardless of paternity. In the antebellum South, white women who gave birth to children of partial African ancestry had confounded racial slavery, yet such imperfections in the social structure had not significantly threatened racial hierarchy. But the case was different for white women after the Civil War. With only the one drop rule to guard white supremacy, all white women had to give birth to all white children. As a result, no white person ever challenged sex between a white man and a black woman with anything more than verbal condemnations. And here is where the ideological somersault came into play. Charles Carroll, a writer intent on proving scientifically that black people were not human beings, defined amalgamation as solely the result of sex between black men and white women. Because white women were the great stronghold, the vital points of creation, he explained, the white race would not be absorbed and destroyed by amalgamation as long as white women confined themselves to white men. The illustrations accompanying Carroll's treatise depict a white woman cuddling an ape-like black baby, a fashionably dressed white couple with a very dark little girl walking between them. Here, the man casts the woman a suspicious glance as she stares coldly ahead, and two white parents at the bedside of three children, one of whom is black, with the subtitle, "Will your next child be a Negro?" Likewise, White's writer William Smith reasoned that the transgression of white men were individual and limited, whereas those of white women struck mortally at the existence of the family itself. True, it was disgraceful that white men had already mixed African and European blood, yet those transgressions could not even in the slightest conceivable degree make a difference. For according to Smith, women alone were the carriers of racial identity. The blood of white women remained absolutely pure, he insisted, and it is the inflexible resolution of the South to preserve that purity, no matter how dear the cost. I mean, this is just absolutely silly racial nonsense. It sounds like something you would see on 4chan today. Yeah, it's okay if it's okay if white men get Asian wives or Latino wives or even, want to bleach black women, as some 4chan guys like to say. But if white women do it, oh no, this is race trading. This is being a race traitor, right? It's absolutely ridiculous. The one drop rule was codified in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision of 1896 that established segregation by the doctrine of separate but equal. Homer Plessy, who had challenged a Louisiana law requiring separate railway cars for whites and colored people, described himself 1/8 black. Plessy's lawyer asked rhetorically, in the determination to preserve white supremacy through a rigid color line, the depredations of white men upon black women while requiring the strict surveillance of black men and white women. Recall that Jim Crow laws parlayed Jim Crow laws allayed white anxieties about the integration of blacks and whites in places frequented by both sexes, and that white Southerners invoked the dreaded idea of social equality to connote conditions that could result in sexual contact between black men and white women. Lynching not only terrorized black men and women, but it also subordinated white women. White women's fears was, in fact, a favorite theme of lynching apologists, both male and female. Southern academic George Winston thought that white women alone in their farmhouses shuddered in nameless horror at a knock at the door. The black brute is lurking in the dark, he lectured, a monstrous beast, crazed with lust. North Carolina editor Clarence Poe believed that for every Negro who is disturbed by fear of the mob, 100 white women are haunted by the nameless dread. White women themselves made the same point. Even in small towns, the husband cannot venture to leave his wife alone for an hour at night. Writer Cora Harris stated in 1899, "At no time and no place is the white woman safe from the insults and assaults of these creatures." Another white woman portrayed a similarly threatening atmosphere. "Hovering over women in their country homes is a cloud of fear blacker than a starless night," she declared. Perhaps some of this dread on the part of white women stemmed from what they knew would be the violent reaction of their male relatives if a liaison across the color line came to pass or was suspected. These fears of both black men and white men enabled white men to hold fast to their roles as protectors of white women. Such protection was, as before, a bargain. To earn the guardianship of white men against the presumed danger of black men, a white woman had to abide by certain rules. Just as white ideas about the dangers of black men intensified after emancipation, so too did white ideology about the purity of white women. Two things I have to say. I never knew that the Plessy v. Ferguson case, was about Plessy making the argument that I'm basically white, so you should let me on the rail car. I thought he was making that stand sort of like similar to like Rosa Parks, like how Rosa Parks was like, I'm definitely black, so let me sit wherever I want because this should be illegal. Plessy was making the case, I should be able to sit wherever I want because I'm white, like I'm more white than I am black. But the one drop rule went against that. You know what I'm saying? Second thing I have to say here is that, I'm not surprised that some of these white women back then were writing about, black men being this big fear in the background, right? Because number one, all men want to hurt women. And two, they just want to appease their brothers, their fathers, their sons. White women oftentimes align with the interest of white men, right? And so even if they were having consensual relationships with black men at the time, right? Even if they loved those black men, as soon as they were found out and terrorized in their own way, they would turn around and blame the black man for their transgression. So not surprised that they would be, writing all this stuff to sort of assuage the egos of their fragile white husbands, etc. Let's continue here. Such ideas would never cut entirely across white class lines, but in the late 19th century, convictions about the sexual depravity of poor white women began to command less power. Dominant ideas about white female purity now came to include poor women more overtly, as those who expounded upon the threat of black men took care to include lower class women in their most sweeping statements. This proneness of the Negro is so well understood, wrote Philip Bruce, that the white women of every class from the highest to the lowest are afraid to venture to any distance alone, or even to wander unprotected in the immediate vicinity of their homes. Maligning Alexander Manley, one North Carolina newspaper, commented that his offending editorial was a sweeping insult to all respectable white women who are poor, and that it slurred every white wife in the South whose condition is poor as to this world's goods. There were also cases to prove that neither a white woman's poverty nor her supposed depravity would particularly benefit a transgressing black man. Cora Twitchell's well-known liaison with Paul Davis first nearly cost Davis his life and then cost him 9 years in prison, and Cora's father was not convicted for shooting the black man. When the lynching of Edward Coy in 1892 was found to rest upon a year-long liaison with a white woman, the fact that the woman was judged to be of bad character did not stop the lynchers. To white Southerners who wished to preserve racial hierarchy in the absence of slavery, it was crucial that both elite and non-elite white women minded the boundaries of the color line and gave birth only to white children. Without slavery to differentiate blacks from poor whites, it was equally important that ideas about the purity of white women included poor women. For to characterize all white women as pure had an important effect. It made sex between a black man and a white woman by definition rape, because a pure white woman, no matter how poor, could not possibly, in white minds, desire sex with a black man. As Frederick Douglass told an audience in Washington, D.C. in 1894, an abandoned woman has only to start the cry that she has been insulted by a black man, to have him arrested and summarily murdered by the mob. Ida Wells likewise observed that no black man was safe from lynching if a white woman, no matter what her standing or motive, cares to charge him with insult or assault. Such had not been the case in the South before the Civil War, and yet at the same time, inclusion in the category of those deserving protection still remained precarious for white women outside the ranks of the elite. Philip Bruce contradicted himself when he wrote that the few white women who have given birth to mulattoes have always been regarded as monsters, and without exception, they have belonged to the most impoverished and degraded caste of whites, by whom they are scrupulously avoided as creatures, who have sunk to the level of the beasts of the field. In the end, the designation of white female purity remained ambiguous on the matter of class. Still, endlessly repeated stories about rape, told by white men and women alike, warned all white women away from transgressive behavior and impressed upon them or themselves the proper behavior required for male protection. In the post-Reconstruction South, the threat and reality of lynching altered black men and white women to the newly rigid boundaries of the color line. In the last decade of the century, whites accused black men of rape more than at any time before or since, and black men could be lynched for all manner of objectionable behavior toward white women. As anti-lynching protesters knew, rape could be defined so broadly that an insult, a grimace, an unwanted glance, or an accidental touch might be transformed in white minds into sexual violence. Proposing marriage or writing a letter could count too. Jesse Duke cautioned his readers as early as 1887. If something is not done to break up these lynchings, it will be so after a while that they will lynch every colored man that looks at a white woman with a twinkle in his eye. A black minister likewise warned his listener in 1892, if one of our men look at a white woman very hard and she complains, he is lynched for it. Black protesters repeatedly reminded their enemies of crucial change since the war. Recall the words of Ida Wells in 1892, the world knows that the crime of rape was unknown during 4 years of civil war, when the white women of the South were at the mercy of the race which is all at once charged with being a bestial one. Recall the observation of Frederick Douglass 2 years later that before the end of the war, black men were seldom or never accused of the atrocious crime of feloniously assaulting white women. Such statements continued from Reconstruction era dialogues, were intended to call attention to the falsity of the charges now so frequently brought against black men. In 1893, Henry McNeill Turner described enslaved black men as the virtual custodian of every white lady and child in the South. Likewise, Professor Kelly Miller of Howard University wrote in 1899, when the care and safety of the white women of the South were entrusted to the keeping of the slaves, they returned inviolate all that had been entrusted to their hands. The theme of safe white women in bygone days was not the sole province of anti-lynching activists. White Southerners made the same point, but instead to justify lynching. Bishop Atticus Green Haygood of Georgia wrote of rape in 1893. This particular crime was practically unknown before emancipation. Only one case I heard mentioned from my childhood till after the war. Georgia columnist Charles Henry Smith agreed, writing before the war, there was seldom a personal outrage of the kind indicated from the Potomac to the Rio Grande. Publisher Walter Hines Page believed that slavery had restrained black men from sexual assault, writing of a social crime that was unknown and impossible in slavery, and that was infrequent as long as the manners and traditions of slavery survived. White women, too, lifted their voices in accord. In 1897, Rebecca Latimer Felton lectured, "When I recollect that the crime of rape on white women was almost unknown among Negro slaves before the war, I ask myself, why has the crime assumed such proportions in the years following the war?" Such remembrances offered a wistful portrayal of loyal and submissive slave men who had taken no part in seizing their freedom. If only, former Georgia Governor William J. Northern lamented in 1899, white Southerners had erected a monument to wartime slaves for their unceasing devotion to our homes and the gallant protection they gave the women and children of the South, all during the dark days of our bloody civil strife. A white woman likewise reminiscent about faithful slaves who were the only protectors of our mothers and the little children while our fathers were in the war. The difference between the white story and that of black protesters lay in the respective comparisons with the 1890s. While protesters invoked the former paucity of rape charges in order to prove the ulterior motives of lynchers, apologists invoked nostalgia for a once enslaved and harmless generation of black men as a preface to warnings about a supposedly new generation of criminals. Protesters capitalized on the white narrative about loyal black men, ignoring the truth of slaves' wartime betrayal and escape in an effort to catch white Southerners in their lies. It is impossible, Frederick Douglass wrote in 1892 of black men, that this peaceful and inoffensive class has suddenly and all at once become changed into a class of the most daring and repulsive criminals. Yet that was exactly what whites argued by century's end. I think, man, that's deep. That's very deep right here, these last two paragraphs. You know, I'll just say this, man. It's funny how, everybody believes that every new generation of black men, in particular, let's just talk about black men in this case, is somehow worse than the previous, but there's never the fault laid on the white supremacists and the society that continues to discriminate against black men. Like, for example, right now we have this sort of nostalgia in the black community about the 1950s and the 60s for some reason, when Jim Crow was still alive and well. And people were saying, the black family was together, brother. The black family didn't divorce. There wasn't all this sort of debauchery and this sort of denigration between each other and amongst ourselves during the times of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when the black family was together, brother. Let's forget, that the majority of black families lived in poverty. The majority of black families didn't have access to education. The majority of black families, weren't like owners of homes and things like that, right? Like it's nothing to, reminisce about the past. And also, the white supremacists are fans of that too. They like to always say, yeah, back in the day, the Negroes used to be better. And the whites at this time that were lynching black folks were saying, yeah, before the end of slavery, there was the peaceful Negroes. But now that these new generation of Negroes are being born after the end of slavery, all they know is how to take from the white man and commit crimes. When before, when they were in our houses or in our fields or in the shacks behind our houses, these people were under control, they were docile and that sort of stuff. Very, very interesting, how once again, history doesn't repeat, it sort of rhymes. And yeah, man, let's not, continue to denigrate our people or think that we have some fault in us. Let's always remember that, the societies around us are the ones that are making us into these monsters, right? And it's not our parents, it's not our family structures, it's not none of that. It's just what the society is sort of like making us out to be. Exactly, because these black men were not out here raping every single white woman. Like, the majority of the cases of these black men getting lynched for rape on white women were not true. These were not true cases, but they use that as an excuse to say, we're going to just lynch all of y'all, right? The same way they use like the Moynihan report or the idea about black single mothers and the broken black family as the cause for black men, committing crime or selling drugs or that sort of thing, right? Like this is not true. Let's just continue here in the book. So, the story white people told themselves about the security of slavery days served as a lead-in to their most important defense. The rape of white women justified the lynching of black men. The lynching of such a monster, Charles Henry wrote in 1893, is nothing nothing compared with what he has done. There is no torture that could suffice. Sometimes this conviction was leavened with an acknowledgement of lynching's barbarity, though still followed by warnings that nothing would change until black men ceased to rape white women. A Georgia editor maintained in 1894, for example, that his reporters never failed to condemn lynching, but then cautioned, when they stop making assaults upon helpless women, the crime of lynching will stop. In such defenses, whites commonly expressed distrust of the Southern legal system, claiming the ineffective courts required vigilante justice. Still, whites who pled for effective courts gave no thought of the impossibility of fair trials. Potential jurors, no doubt, took part in lynchings, as did sheriffs and judges. In fact, many white advocates first called for fair trials, then proceeded to assume a lynched black man guilty, even though no trial, much less a fair one, had taken place. Atticus Haygood's denouncement of one lynching was typical of this reasoning. It was horrible to torture the guilty wretch, he wrote. White Southerners also repeatedly expressed special horror at the thought of a white woman testifying in court on the subject of rape, and some endorsed lynching on those grounds alone. One black dissenter unmasked such pleas, pointing out that testimony given to the mob is the same as testimony given in the court, noting that an alleged rape victim testified before the mob of 3,000 men, women, and children. Black protesters continued to demonstrate that when whites recorded their reasons for specific lynchings, the cause most often named was not rape, but murder. No one was more prominent in this task than Ida B. Wells, prompted to action after the murder of her dear friend Thomas Moss in 1892. Moss, along with two other black men, had opened the successful People's Grocery in Memphis, thereby taking black business away from nearby white-owned stores. When the men armed and defended themselves against the threat of attack, they were arrested and jailed, then seized and shot to death in the middle of the night. Moss and his colleagues had been lynched, but they had not been accused of rape. This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was, Wells wrote later. In her subsequent investigations, Wells found that only a third of the victims had even been charged with rape. In spite of her tireless work, white people who had no use for such facts paid her no mind, and even those who meant well did not always comprehend her larger point. When the Chicago reformer Jane Addams condemned lynching without challenging statistics on rape, Wells responded angrily. This record, easily within the reach of everyone who wants it, she wrote, makes inexcusable the statement that Negroes are lynched only because of their assaults upon womanhood. Indeed, whites continue to invoke the political rights of black men as the catalyst of alleged sexual transgressions against white women. Charles Henry Smith believed that in order to halt crime and outrage, blacks would have to be disenfranchised. Rebecca Latimer Felton thought that so long as your politics take the colored man into your embraces on election day to control his vote, so long will lynchings prevail because the causes of it grow and increase. Corey Harris described black men as lustful savages, concluding, to him, liberty has always meant license of one sort or another. Is it any wonder North Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana have passed laws virtually disenfranchising him? Anti-lynching protesters called attention to this conflation and political rights and rape in an effort to lay it bare. Frederick Douglass explicitly located rape accusations with the advent of black political power. It is only since the Negro has become a citizen and a voter, he wrote in 1892, that this charge has been made. This was an invention with a well-defined motive, Douglass contended, a means of paving the way for our entire disenfranchisement. Ida Wells, too, believed that rape charges were a means to wrest political and economic power from black men, arguing that lynching could be explained by white Southern resentment at giving the Afro-American his freedom, the ballot box, and the civil rights law. For W.E.B. Du Bois, the black historian who was born during Reconstruction, terrorism, lynching, and disenfranchisement, formed a triad. Lynching, he believed, was an attempt to terrorize and grew directly out of the disenfranchisement of 1876. Anti-lynching activists also continued to invoke the idea of black manhood, equating it as before with freedom, economic independence, citizenship, and political rights. We are men, and our aim is perfect manhood, to be men among men. wrote Douglas in an 1892 denunciation of lynching. In an effort to invert dominant ideas that equated black people with savagery and white people with civilization, Wells implored black men to defend their name and manhood from this vile accusation, declaring that whites were wedded to any method, however revolting, any measure, however extreme, for the subjugation of the young manhood of the race. Even as white people often named murder as the cause of lynching, then their stories about the rape of white women continue to serve them best in their post-war quest for racial supremacy. This was a discourse that at once glorified slavery and presented black autonomy and authority as lethal to white people. In the time of slavery, if a Negro was killed, the owner sustained a loss of property. Douglas wrote in a pamphlet distributed to the thousands at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Now he is not restrained by any fear of such loss. Ida Wells reiterated the same point. The slave was rarely killed. He was too valuable, she wrote in 1895. But emancipation came and the vested interests of the white man in the Negro's body were lost. 3 days after the Wilmington riots in 1898, an anonymous black woman, I cannot sign my name and live, she noted, made the same point in a letter to President William McKinley. When our parents belonged to them, why, the Negro was all right, she wrote. Now, when they work and accumulate property, they are all wrong. By the 1890s, whites had transformed ideas about the agency of white women in an effort to reinforce new ideas about the dangers of empowered black men. Now, sex between a white woman and a black man was not met with near inevitable and public white violence, directed largely at the black man, who was almost certain to be branded a rapist. Lynching deterred black men and white women from conforming sexual liaisons in a world without racial slavery. To whites, such liaisons put black men and white women on a too equal footing, illuminated the fact that white men could not always control white women, and blurred the lines of racial categories that were so crucial to maintaining the racial hierarchy previously sustained by slavery. It was in the face of this overwhelming violence that black protesters told alternative stories about the agency of white women and exposed the politics of lynching. But exposing those facts remained a perilous endeavor. On a spring Sunday in the last year of the 19th century, there occurred one of the most notorious public murders in Southern history. Sam Hodes, accused of killing a white man in Georgia's Cotton Belt and assaulting the man's white wife, maintained that he had acted in self-defense and had never touched the woman. Hodes was tied to a pine tree and burned to death before 2,000 people. Morning worshipers had heard the news at church, and many white spectators and participants arrived on 2 special trains that ran from Atlanta. For sickening sights, harrowing details, and blood-curdling incidents, the white Atlanta papers observed, the lynching of Sam Hodes was unsurpassed. Afterwards, spectators eagerly snatched bones, carried away pieces of flesh, and fought over the ashes. The only arrest made was that of a white man charged with disputing Hodes's guilt and thereby using language which was likely to cause disorder or a riot. The subsequent editorial in the Atlanta Constitution encompassed the major themes of the decade. Black manhood was equated with aggression in the new and insolent generation of black men. The alleged rape victim was a farm wife who stayed at home filled with dread over black men. Her chastity would be cross-questioned if the case were taken into court, and Hodes was assumed unequivocally guilty. W.B. Du Bois, who lived in Atlanta at the time, later recalled how shortly after Hodes's murder, he had started over to the offices of the Constitution to try to put before the South what happened in cases of this sort. On his way, he came upon a meat market in which he later recalled they were exhibiting the fingers of Sam Hodes. Du Bois turned back, understanding the futility and the danger of his mission. What a sick thing to do, man. And I've heard that story before of W.B. Du Bois like seeing like the fingers of a black man at like a butcher shop in the window. I've heard that story, but I didn't know it was related to Sam Hodes, a black man who supposedly murdered a white man and then raped his wife. That's a definite challenge to white supremacy at the time. So that's the end of chapter 8, though, and that's the end of the book. We finished the book. Congratulations to anybody who made it this far in the live stream series. And I want to give a shout out to everybody who has tuned in and made this the biggest book to react series that we've ever done on this channel. Shout out to all of you. And we only have the epilogue left and a little bit of the chapter on how she did the research for this book, because it's, it must have been extremely hard to do. But I'm going to be reading the epilogue in that chapter, giving final commentary on this book and reading any comments for anybody that comes in. I know I did this, kind of early in the morning on a Friday. I know a lot of y'all are at work. I know a lot of people like to join in on these live streams, but I try to get it in to match up with my schedule. And you can always watch these on the playback on 2X. So apologies to anybody who likes to be in here live when this happens. But listen to this on 2X. Have a good afternoon and enjoy like a nice walk or a nice run in the gym or something. Anyway, let's continue here. Epilogue. The haunting walk that W.E.B. Du Bois took through the streets of Atlanta in 1899 stands as a marker for the 20th century legacy of the history of sex between Black men and white women in the American South. On that spring day in the last year of the 19th century, Du Bois set out to explain to white Southerners that Sam Hodes, though already lynched, was innocent of rape. It is not surprising that he turned back after discovering the dead man's severed fingers on public display in the neighborhood. Nor would it surprise modern-day readers if Du Bois had taken a different route, missed the gruesome display, and yet turned back nonetheless. White violence in response to sex between Black men and white women, whether the sex was consensual, imagined, or trumped up, rape is a familiar story. But if what made Du Bois turn back is familiar, what first made him set out is less so. Du Bois started out to the offices of the white newspaper with the conviction that rational explanation would prevent future travesties of justice. That in turn suggests Du Bois's understanding that lethal white violence in response to sex between Black men and white women was a recent phenomenon, and therefore a phenomenon with a history. The stories told in this book have illuminated the historical development of whites' alarm about sexual liaisons between Black men and white women in the South. A white woman and a Black man married in 1681 in the colonial Chesapeake, the first sites of contact between Europeans and Africans in what would become the United States. Although elite white neighbors who attended the wedding of Nell Butler and Charles were not untroubled by the union, it did not present white Southerners with the same complications as the illicit liaisons between white women and Black men that would come to pass in the antebellum South. Yet at the same time, the sexual liaisons between Polly Lane and Jim, Doretha Bourne and Edmund, Lucy Anderson and James Nunez, and Caroline Hughley and an unnamed Black man, along with other white women and Black men before the Civil War, were never as troublesome to white Southerners as those that transpired after the advent of African American freedom and the claiming of citizenship by Black men. Negro suffrage, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote at the dawn of the 20th century, ended a civil war by beginning a race feud. Du Bois and other Black protesters had quickly come to realize that this feud included the sexualization of politics. The charge of rape against colored Americans was invented by the white South after Reconstruction to excuse mob violence, wrote Du Bois in 1919, naming such violence as the recognized method of re-enslaving Blacks. Decades later, when Du Bois recalled his mission to explain the truth about Sam Hodes in the spring of 1899, he did not condemn his own callow visions of justice. It had been, he wrote, but a young man's idealism, not by any means false, but also never universally true. Shout out to W.B. Du Bois. He's one of my personal heroes for why I'm pursuing a degree in sociology right now in Hungary. And I can't wait to graduate and walk in his shoes. So that's the end of the epilogue. Let's go here. Searching for stories, a note on sources. Many colleagues, friends, and readers have asked about the process or ordeal of finding the evidence for this book. No archive contained any sort of index on the topic of sex between white women and Black men, and only rarely did a card catalog heading for miscegenation or interracial marriage lead to one or two brief references. For the most part, I gathered my cases from a variety of leads, both textual and conversational. On my first visit to the Maryland Hall of Records, the archivist Phoebe Jacobson listened to a description of my project and led me to the long handwritten transcripts about the colonial marriage of Nell Butler and Charles. Later, I found the case mentioned in a number of published works. For the story of Polly Lane and Jim, I came across a reference to Guyon Griffiths Johnson's 1937 work, Antebellum, North Carolina, and followed the lead to the North Carolina Division of Archives and History. There I found the cited documents in a large scrapbook of letters to the governor. When I turned the pages, I found more letters about Polly and Jim. And when I turned the page back the other way, there were still more cases. Again, I later found more recent published references to the case. For the story of Doretha Bourne and Edmund, I went to the Library of Virginia armed with references gleaned from James Hugo Johnston's 1970 Compendium of Cases, Race Relations in Virginia and Miscegenation in the South. There I searched until I found a case with sufficient documentation for a detailed study. I first came across the Nunez and Hughley stories in Helen Tunnicliffe's Catterall's 5-volume series from the 1920s and 1930s, judicial cases concerning American slavery and the Negro. From there, I found the printed court transcripts from the Georgia Supreme Court, which I then followed backward to the manuscript county court records in the Georgia Department of Archives and History. The American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission testimony from the Civil War years came from a lead in Herbert G. Gutman's 1976 book, The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom. When I followed several intriguing footnotes to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., I found documents that illuminated much of what I had found for the antebellum era. In addition, an assortment of sources, including court cases, personal papers, newspapers, pamphlets, and congressional records, charted wartime changes and white responses. My principal documents for the Reconstruction years were the 13 printed volumes of testimony taken by the federal government about the Ku Klux Klan, as well as a number of other government reports that included testimony from Black and white Southerners. For the last decades of the 19th century, I began with references from W. Fitzhugh Brundage's 1993 work, Lynching in the New South, followed by a long and profitable conversation with Professor Brundage. After reading the newspaper accounts of the liaisons between Peter Stamps and Ida Abercrombie and Paul Davis and Cora Twitchell, along with a few briefer cases, I tracked the protagonists through censuses and local histories, and for the Davis Twitchell case, searched for the original court papers at the Library of Virginia. The papers, including an envelope with Cora's penciled love letters crushed inside, were tied with brittle cloth ribbon and had not been uncreased since 1897. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. It was not difficult to consult the voluminous outpouring from both sides of the color line of published articles, essays, and commentaries addressing directly or obliquely the issue of sex between white women and Black men, including the alternative stories told by Jesse C. Duke, Ida B. Wells, and Alexander Manley. The stories I mention more briefly throughout the chapters derive from any number of sources. Some came to light through references in other history books ranging from early 20th century works to the most recent scholarship on the South. Some came from colleagues who were aware of my topic of inquiry and generally sent me documents they had found in the course of their research. Many I came across while searching for something else. For example, in folders of pardon papers to antebellum governors, in county court documents, in newspapers, or in travelers' accounts. Still others were offered by people who befriended me at the archives. On one memorable day, an older white woman who was a professional genealogist led me to a case of a white woman who had murdered the child she had borne by her father's slave. The genealogist had found the document while researching a white family, but had omitted the information from her notes because she told me they wouldn't want to know. Wow. Okay. Oh, wow. That's such an incredible story. Such an incredible story. I had to just soak that in, man. Like, still, infanticide. Like, one of the things that, surprised me so much about this book was the level of infanticide that happened. Like, some of these white women were Massa's daughter or Massa's wife and getting pregnant by the slaves, and then they murdered the child. That's insane. The genealogist found the document while researching a white family, but had omitted the information from her notes because she told me they wouldn't want to know. Yeah, like most white folks, they don't want to know their own history. All professional librarians and archivists of all colors were, without exception, immensely helpful, though not all fellow researchers were so forthcoming. In one instance, a white woman told me that I would never find anything on the topic. When I told her that I already had, she admonished me to make sure say they're trash. Make sure you say they're trash about the white women involved, thereby helping prove the legacy of part of my argument. Absolutely horrible. See, that's a racist white woman right there. That's a racist white woman. A white woman told me I would never find anything on this topic, And then when Martha Hodes says, well, I already found a few instances of white women marrying black men, you know, cheating on their husbands, having children, right? She said, the other white woman said, well, make sure you say those white women were dirty, trash, ghetto sluts. Like that's racism right there, man. That shows you that, you know, as progressive as we might think we are, and it would be hella unfortunate if Martha Hodes was talking about like a fellow PhD level historian who said that to her. Absolutely disgusting, you know, that somebody would say that. But that goes to show, like, they're out there, man. These racists are out there. So the rest of the gear is just notes, and she has a lot of notes. And so I encourage y'all to pick up this book if you want to read the notes, because the notes section, and this is heavily researched. This is a heavily researched book with a lot of notes and indentations, a lot of footnotes here in this very, very dope book. This is by far one of my favorite books that I've ever read. Very fascinating book, interesting book, had me captivated, had me laughing, had me crying, had me in deep contemplation, had me going through so many different emotions, man. I'm just skimming through the pages to see if there's anything else to read other than the notes. But yeah, I hope y'all enjoyed this as well. Really would like to know what people thought in the poll. I don't think anybody voted on the poll. I think people might have not got the notification. Okay, so no votes in the poll. We're about to wrap up this live stream here. Okay, so we got 0 votes this time, but that's okay because y'all gonna catch this on the playback. But I want y'all to know I appreciate everybody who tuned into this live stream. I appreciate Martha Hodes for writing this book. And man, all my commentary is recorded on the previous live stream, so I don't even have to say much. 10 out of 10 for this book. 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10. Excellent book, excellent book. Shout out to Martha Hodes. And y'all be easy out there. My name is Simon Hill.